Hello, my name is Roberto Delgadillo. I am a student services librarian at the University Library at the University of California, Davis. Today I'd like to give you, or share with you rather, my recommended titles for National Hispanic Heritage Month. The first book I'd like to highlight is The Undocumented Americans by Karla Cornejo Villavicencio. This book I particularly enjoyed because, for me, and having come to the United States, I spent some time as an undocumented immigrant, and this book perfectly captures through a series of vignettes that, although they take place in the northeast of the United States, they do capture the universal sense that a lot of undocumented immigrants face all throughout the United States, and I suspect around the world, in terms of experiences. And what she captures is, the struggles, the pain, and yet at the same time, she provides a nice counter narrative through these stories, vignettes, that show that they don't necessarily portray the, lone, struggling immigrant suffering in silence. They do show the various aspects of what they face, and although, struggles and the issues of being recognized and having to fight for those things are certainly there, it does nevertheless capture that these are human beings and that they are contributing, and they do so with laughter, humor, and of course what's been mentioned before, the struggles. But it just provides a broader picture than what is usually or sometimes shown, however sympathetic or well-meaning that aspect may be of wanting to portray undocumented Americans. This book is also significant because it was also a National Book Award finalist, and the writer herself she was in essence a DACA recipient, although she doesn't get into that as she notes. And she's from Ecuador, Ecuadorian American, if you will, and also attended Harvard. All right. The next book I like to highlight is a work by Roberto Lovato entitled Unforgetting, a memoir of family, migration, gangs, and the revolution in the Americas. And what I particularly enjoyed about this book is that it was very reminiscent to my experiences growing up in Southern California, as he does as well, specifically Los Angeles. Although his perspective is slightly different, mine primarily because he's from El Salvador and I'm from Nicaragua. But what he discusses basically is it's an interesting book because it captures how can I put it? It's a coming of age story. It's a thriller, and it does an excellent job of combining the history, if you will, of the Americas and the interplay between Central America and Latin America, which then in turn, for better or for worse, to help us explain and better understand the current situation among the undocumented Americans, now coming from Central America, and that has been in the news of late. And in this particular instance, he discusses again growing up in Los Angeles and then subsequently returning to participate in the El Salvadorian Civil War and then subsequent return back to the United States, and seeing how all of that, his influence and how his earlier experiences in the United States have obviously, like many things, changed, but in the case of El Salvador, for the worse, and helps better to explain the tragedy that sometimes one experiences and sees with the coming of Central American migrants and immigrants from Central America and vice versa, and the policies that have been implemented by the United States in its efforts to protect its borders and vice versa. And it's just an interesting book because again, it looks into the shadow of exploitation, counter-revolution in Central America, but it's also as a coming-of-age story, and certainly there are those instances of horror and terror. It also has a love story, and it recounts it does a beautiful job of recounting his own family story, and what subsequently happened in El Salvador, and again, the way that it impacted the United States and the way it views immigrants coming from that region. And although the histories are certainly slightly different, it does a very good job of, again, conveying what has been happening in Central America beyond what has been, sometimes portrayed in the media. So yes, certainly an excellent book to keep an eye out for. The next book I like to highlight is one entitled Borderlands, La Frontera by Gloria Anzaldúa. Always a tricky last name, for me anyway. Basically, this book was influential to me as an undergraduate at the University of California, Santa Cruz. It really helped put together, for me anyway at the time, a better understanding of the multiple, if you will, identities that sometimes undocumented immigrants have to kind of navigate and negotiate with day to day. And Gloria's experiences as a Chicana, a lesbian, and an activist and a writer through a series of poetry, essays, and short pieces, for me, helped me profoundly think about the different identities that we certainly have to encounter, assume, and contend with on a day-to-day basis. And this book, as a result of this, because it's been so influential to so many different scholars, is basically a foundational text in the formation of Chicano studies. And it has obviously impacted other areas as well, too, beyond Chicano studies. So again, it just helps us re-understand what is meant by identity, and as well as the title implies, what is a border? What does it imply? And with that, the changing notions of that, be they social, political, and or sexual. So again, it's a very, not just a foundational text, but an important one as well, too, to be certainly be looked at, regardless of whatever field it is that you're looking at as well, too. The next book I like to highlight is one by Javier O. Huerta, and it's entitled American Copia, an Immigrant Epic. And what I like about it, through a series of a very creative use and collection of interplay, rather, of poetry, fiction, and nonfiction, Huerta uses food, and specifically the supermarket, as a guiding motif to help explain the immigrant experience. And I guess I identified it very strongly with it, because in coming to the United States as an undocumented immigrant, there were those instances where you're just overwhelmed among the different things as you're trying to, realize, beyond, I'm encountering a different language and a different history and different customs, just the abundance of food. And obviously, this was not applicable all throughout. At the time, for instance, I did know about the issue of food insecurity and the way that it impacts some communities versus others. But Huerta's work does that, and he does so in a way that, I should also note too that it's written in English and in Spanish. He does so in a way that, for anyone reading this, you'll begin to see those connections and realize about the interplay, basically, of how these personal circumstances begin to affect you, and think about what it is that, as one undergoes through the experience of wanting to go from an undocumented immigrant to a documented one, and how you pass that on, and along the way captures perfectly the experiences of what immigrants face, whether they're in a regional setting or, regional setting obviously, but an urban and rural as well. And the little vignettes, because that's what this interplay of stories is really all about, really does just, how can I say it once again, that they're funny. They're just humorous, and at the same time they're very original. There's always a different take, and as has been the theme throughout a lot of these books that I recommend, they provide a nice counterweight, a counter-narrative to what is often understood or viewed as the long-suffering and quiet immigrant who toils in the background. And while certainly that is the case, there are those experiences that make you realize these are human lives, and they are different, and they experience different emotions. They are not just mere cartoon images to be held, in some cases, contempt, or to be held for pity. It is far more than that. So it really gets to the riddle what is meant in times by, well, what is my identity in relation to that of others. So, highly recommended. The next book I like to highlight is a new collection. Actually, it's his first collection of short stories by Jaime Cortez, who's well known as a performance artist, graphic novelist, and someone who's engaged in the work that deals and goes around sexuality, identity, and the impact that HIV/AIDS has had in BIPOC and specifically Latino communities. It's again, fictional set of short stories that take place in the 1970s in what has been at times been called Steinbeck country. And my first encounter with Steinbeck country, having come from Southern California, is obviously going to Northern California, is this understanding of what it means to be and take place and what goes on in a rural agricultural setting. And for me to encounter that, it was very different and was heavily informed by, well, the works of John Steinbeck. And there, for better or for worse, you come across, somewhat one-dimensional depictions of Mexican and Mexican Americans. And this book is kind of nice because it really shows that there are other stories, if you will, that go beyond that. They are, of course, funny, tragic, but mostly they're untold. And so this, in a way, kind of spearheads a growing movement to capture these experiences, which, certainly have been captured by others, but more so in an academic and, well, I hate to say it, somewhat of a dry experience. Whereas these kind of tell you they're a little bit funny, and also they just capture those aspects of not just humor, but queerness, tenderness. And so you do wonder, oh yes, what is in fact going on here, and how is it possible that all these can be encapsulated in, say, one person or one experience? And I think that's his overall point, that we all carry these stories. So it's something to be looked at, just because it's, again, beyond just the humorous aspect of it. It does make you ponder and think about, well, the very, especially now and of late anyway, dark times for a lot of undocumented Americans, what it means to grow up and come to grips as we all come together as Americans, if you will. So again, very funny, very well recommended, and provides a nice counter-narrative to what is often viewed as these, as I said before, one-dimensional views of undocumented immigrants or agricultural workers working in certainly rural settings.
Great.
Another book that I certainly recommend is a work by Laura E. Gómez entitled Inventing Latinos, A New Story of American Racism. And this one is nice because it's very much an academic work, and it nicely puts together the issues of racism, colonialism, white dominance, and community resistance, where it should be, if you will. And that's obviously going to refer to the United States and the nature of race and the interplay, domestic and foreign, between the United States and Latin America. And so what it is that it takes on and examines how these relations have led to not just the growth of Latinos in the United States, but the way that these relations have impacted the way that the United States and those populations that have been here view incoming undocumented immigrants or Latinos in general, and often in a position of power and dominance. And so she does a skillful analysis of the interplay between these different relations, and is able to do so in a way that what you are in essence left with is a roadmap to understand the role that Latinos, documented or otherwise, play in the United States, and that they have played for some time. And unfortunately, at times when it does reveal itself, it deals so in the face of racism. But she provides one with the tools to better understand when and how this can be understood, and perhaps, down the road, overcome, if you will, as we all try to come together, and gives one a broader understanding that when we talk about America, it really does mean the Americas, and the impact that, again, relations between separate countries begin to have upon one another. I think what I also like about it too is that, again, very, very much an academic work, but written so in very straightforward, language, very easily understood. You're not overwhelmed, unfortunately, with one of the drawbacks of some academic writing, which is a little bit dry. This is not. This is a really nicely, easy understood book, and so that what you are in essence left with is, well, a conversation you would normally would have anyone, that helps one understand our role, their role, everyone's role in the United States. The next book I like to discuss is actually the first book that won a National Book Award, or I believe it was the Pulitzer, actually, and that is Natalie Diaz's Postcolonial love poem. And what's significant about it, and this is what I meant, is that she is the first Latina poet to have won that award. She is the second Latinx poet, however. The first, believe it or not, and sometimes people don't know this, is William Carlos Williams, whose mother was Puerto Rican. And he won that, some time ago. But she is the first Latina, but the second Latinx poet. And what she focuses on is the intersection of desire and post-colonialism, and the legacy of colonialism, and the way that they impact queer identities, indigenous activities, and Latina, Native American resistance, and wrapped around the theme of post-colonial and what it means to be post-colonial. And she provides, if you will, in a series of poems, a way to experience them and discuss them. And this is her second book. Her first one, which I also highly recommend, was a book of poems called When My Brother Was an Aztec. And although that deals with issues, unfortunately, of addiction and the way they also impact Latino, Latina, and Native American indigenous communities, it is nevertheless a powerful work. And this one just certainly follows in that particular vein, even more so. Again, highly recommend it for those of you that love poetry, like me. Finally, I'd like to end my selections with a work by one of our professors here, and that is La Gente, Struggles for Empowerment and Community Self-Determination in Sacramento, by Lorena V. Márquez. She's a faculty member in our Chicana Studies department here. And what I like about it is that she captures and traces, rather, the rise of the Chicano movement in Sacramento and the role that everyday people had in putting together lasting and transformative changes that were taking place in the 1960s and 70s. And what's particularly interesting about it is that she does so in a way that usually when we think about these changes in the Chicano movement, we usually think of a select few number of organizations or charismatic personalities. And instead, she focuses and reveals that the people behind these changes, and certainly not just, Sacramento, but elsewhere, where usually the story takes place, if you will, that it was carried out by, the most marginalized, the working poor, immigrants, and or the undocumented, and the undereducated. And this is really going to be one of two works. And if I may say so, she plans to follow up on what the role that these populations have played in the, subsequently in the 80s and 90s. But this one covers really well what was taking place in the 60s and 70s. And it's significant because she's helping to put together and fill out, if you will, and contributes heavily to the role that these populations have played, and gives us a better understanding as to the Chicano movement and how it took place and developed and how it involved others therein. So an excellent work. And as a side note, she also is contributing to a nice body of testimonies and oral histories that, again, fill out what we know about the Chicano movement and how it's impacted other movements since the 1960s and 70s. And with that, thank you very much. Have a nice day.